In this video, we're diving into 7 spine-chilling ghost stories straight from the front lines of healthcare. These tales come from nurses who have encountered the unexplainable while caring for their patients. From eerie encounters in dark hospital hallways to mysterious apparitions in patient rooms, these stories will leave you questioning what really happens when the lights go out. Get ready for a journey into the unknown, where the line between life and death blurs, and the spirits of the past may still linger. Story number 1. When I was a new nurse, I worked in the Children's Cancer Center. It's a unit that many nurses find difficult to stay in for long. It's not because they don't want to help the children with cancer, but because it's incredibly sad and heartbreaking. It's tough to see children pass away so young. One week, I was caring for a boy named Adam. Adam had blood cancer. His parents were very kind and understanding. Adam didn't know how sick he was. Sometimes we adults could learn a lot from these little ones. When Adam wasn't in pain, he would play, laugh, and smile. Everyone loved him. Adam was only 3 years old. I also have a 3-year-old son at home, and I couldn't imagine what Adam's parents were going through. I couldn't bear the thought of something like that happening to my own son. Every week I watched Adam get weaker and sicker. The cancer was making him ill, and the medicine we gave him made him feel even worse. Yet, despite it all, he continued to smile and just wanted to watch cartoons. One day, while watching TV on his bed, his heart suddenly stopped. He passed away with his eyes closed, looking so peaceful. His parents were devastated, but they had known that he might not make it through all his treatments. I remember getting home that night at 7:45 p.m. My husband was about to leave for work. His shift started at 8 p.m., but we live only 5 minutes from his workplace. When I got home, my 3-year-old son was already asleep. My husband left for work, and I went to take a shower. As I was showering, I kept thinking of Adam, and then of my son. When I stepped out of the shower and started drying myself with a towel, I saw 4 little fingers underneath the door. I thought it was my son because sometimes he would do that when I was in the bathroom. I said, "Baby, why are you still up?" I saw the little fingers continue to feel around underneath the door. I laughed and said, Okay, Mommy's coming out now." I got dressed and wrapped my hair in a towel. I looked under the door and the fingers were still there. But when I opened the door, smiling, no one was there. I called my son's name, but he didn't respond, and he wasn't in the hallway either. I went to my son's room, and he was still fast asleep. I went back out, closed the door, and headed to the kitchen to drink some water. As I leaned my back against the refrigerator, I suddenly broke down, sobbing. I wasn't scared or anything like that. I just hoped Adam was no longer in pain and that he was in a better place. Afterward, I went back to my son's room, held him close, and fell asleep beside him. Story number 2. I worked in the ICU back in 2002. A lot of people passed away in our unit. I remember one patient named Bob. Bob was 84 years old and suffering from pneumonia. His lungs were filled with fluid, so he was placed on life support and given many medications to keep him alive. One night, Bob's condition worsened. We knew he wouldn't make it through the night. At 11 p.m., he was in really bad shape. No matter what we did, nothing seemed to work. He was old, and his infections had spread throughout his body, not just in his lungs. I called Bob's family and spoke to his son, Robert. Robert asked us to do everything we could to keep Bob alive. He told me that he had just lost his mother 3 months ago and couldn't bear the thought of losing his father too. I asked if Robert could come to the hospital because Bob might not make it through the night. Robert said he had been drinking earlier, and his wife was already asleep, so he wouldn't be able to come. I urged him to find a way to come, as his father's condition was critical. After speaking with Robert, I checked Bob's heart rate. Earlier, it had been in the 120s, but now it had dropped to 56. Bob's heart was already starting to slow down. I continued giving Bob medication to keep him alive, as Robert had requested. By 2 a.m., I was feeling anxious. Bob was going to die, and his family wasn't there. I tried calling Robert again, but there was no answer. At this point, I stayed in the room with Bob because I knew his heart was going to stop soon. The other nurses and the doctor were already in the room, doing everything they could to help Bob. I stepped out of the room and tried calling Robert again. The phone rang 4 times, and then someone picked up. I didn't hear anyone speak, so I thought maybe Robert had answered the phone in his sleep. I kept saying, "Hello? Hello, Robert. Are you there?" Then I heard an old, raspy voice whisper, "Let him go." The person on the line didn't hang up, so I continued, "Is this Robert? Hey, Robert, I don't think your father is going to make it." Just as I said this, I saw Robert and his wife walk into Bob's room. I quickly hung up the phone and went into the room. The doctor was talking to Robert and his wife. They were looking at Bob and crying. After seeing that Bob wouldn't make it, Robert decided to withdraw care and let his father go. We stopped all the medications, and within less than a minute, Bob's heart stopped. After the nurses and the doctor left the room, I asked Robert if there was anyone at their house, and he said no. It was just him and his wife. Their kids were already married and had moved out. Robert told me that his mother had died of cancer at their house about 3 months ago. He was crying a lot because he had lost both his parents that year. To this day, I still wonder who answered the phone when they weren't home. I believe it was Bob's wife, still lingering in their house after she passed. Story number 3. I work in a nursing facility in Central California that has 4 wings. The facility used to be a children's hospital during the TB outbreak in the late 1800s, which means many children died there. Eventually, the facility was converted into a nursing facility for both long-term and short-term care. I was hired at this facility when I first got my vocational nursing license. I had heard staff talk about the sound of children laughing at night, and some patients mentioned seeing children jumping on the unoccupied beds in their rooms. However, there was one particular child that I wasn't aware of. I worked the swing shift from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. One evening, while I was passing out medication to my patients, I encountered a man in his 50s named Timmy. He had been sent to our facility from the hospital due to alcoholic liver cirrhosis, which is the stage of permanent liver damage. Timmy was confused due to the high level of ammonia in his body. We had to give him something called lactulose to make him have multiple bowel movements a day, which would help lower the ammonia levels, but getting him to take his medicine was always a challenge. One night, around 8 p.m., I went into his room to give him his last dose of lactulose for the night. I was struggling because he wouldn't take the medicine from my hand, and when I gave it to him, he didn't know what to do with it and just poured it onto his table. I poured another dose of lactulose into a small medicine cup and handed it to Timmy. Then, holding my own little medicine cup, I said to him, "I haven't seen you in a while, Timmy. Let's have a little toast." We had a toast, and Timmy drank all of his lactulose in one shot. Then he said, "Can I have another shot for the little girl?" I asked him, "What little girl?" He replied, "The little girl in a blue dress. I forgot her name, but she came in and talked to me earlier." I told Timmy that I was out of alcohol, and maybe next time. A few days after that, Timmy's condition worsened, and he passed away. As I continued working there, I noticed the sound of children laughing at night. Occasionally, a dying patient would mention the little girl in a blue dress. They always said, "There's this little girl in a blue dress who came and talked to me last night, but I forgot her name." Everyone forgot her name. It was a strange occurrence. Some patients mentioned how they felt at peace when they talked to that little girl in a blue dress. So I'm not sure if she was a good or bad spirit. Did she come to comfort the dying patients? Or was she taking them? After working there for 6 years, I got hired at a psych facility and left. Story number 4. I am an ED nurse. I remember one night, a man about 4'11" and 300 pounds came to the hospital via ambulance, complaining of stabbing chest pain. This man had an awful stench, and his hygiene was poor. His skin folds appeared dirty and were probably full of sweat and other trapped substances. It was a blend of smells, like vomit and feces. It's hard to describe. According to the patient, he was watching TV and peeling a mango. After he ate the mango and fell asleep on the couch, he woke up with stabbing chest pain, which caused him to feel short of breath, prompting him to dial 911. The patient believed it was the mango that caused his chest pain. Once we got him in, we hooked him up to the monitor, and his cardiac rhythm appeared normal. We did an EKG and confirmed that his rhythm was indeed normal. We took his blood pressure and it was high, so we gave him a shot to bring it down. His blood pressure decreased, but he continued to have chest pain, which made him feel very short of breath. Every breath he took felt like he was being stabbed, according to his description. We drew his blood, and the results showed that his cardiac enzymes were also normal. We weren't sure what was causing his chest pain, so the ED doctor ordered an MRI for his chest as soon as possible. The radiology technician and I took the patient to get the MRI done. For those who don't know, an MRI machine is a giant magnet, and you must not bring anything metal into the MRI room. We checked the patient, ensuring he had no piercings, jewelry, or any metals on him. We got him to the MRI area, and as we opened the door to the room with the MRI machine, a little knife with a yellow handle flew right out from the patient's abdominal skin fold and straight toward the MRI machine. Luckily, none of us got hurt. That instantly solved the mystery of the patient's chest pain and shortness of breath. I couldn't help but laugh when that happened, considering all the work and effort we put into solving this patient's problem, only to discover that it was a small knife stuck in his skin folds. To make a long story short, we completed the MRI and the results were normal. They didn't find anything wrong, but the cause of the chest pain was indeed the knife that had been stuck between his skin folds. I'll admit that I didn't check the patient thoroughly when he first came in. We always have to assess patients from head to toe to ensure they don't have any skin issues. I checked him when he first arrived, but I didn't look between his skin folds. The patient was admitted to the hospital for blood pressure management and observation, and then he was discharged. About a month later, I returned to work one night, and my coworker told me that the patient had died. At first I was confused about who it was, but then he said, "The mango guy." I was shocked and asked what happened. My coworker told me that the patient had suffered a hemorrhagic stroke and was brought to the hospital, where he later died in the ICU. That night while working, I spiked a fever in the middle of my shift, and my supervisor sent me home. I remember walking toward the garage where I parked my car on the 4th floor. I got into the garage elevator, pressed the button for the 4th floor, and moved to the back of the elevator. As the elevator doors closed, a familiar stench filled the space. It smelled like a blend of vomit and feces. I didn't think much of it. The elevators in the garage tend to have a funny smell anyway. Once I reached the 4th floor, I walked over to my car and got in. The moment I turned my car on, something hit the window on the side where I was sitting. I looked and saw a green mango rolling around on the floor. The direction the mango was thrown from was near the elevator. I looked toward it, but there was only a wall in the elevator. No one was there. I backed out, and another mango hit my window. I checked again, but I didn't see anyone. I was creeped out and drove home quickly. I think it might have been a coincidence, and maybe someone in the parking lot was messing with me, but a part of me believes it was the mango guy. Story number 5. I've been a nurse for nearly 15 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things, but there's one experience that still haunts me to this day. It happened during a quiet night shift at the small, rural nursing home where I worked. The facility was old, built in the early 1900s, and had seen countless patients come and go, some leaving more quietly than others. That night, the ward was unusually empty, with only a handful of patients scattered across the floor. The atmosphere was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I was the only nurse on duty, with 2 nursing assistants. Around 2 a.m., I was doing my rounds, checking on the patients, making sure everything was in order. As I approached room 7, I felt a sudden chill in the air. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and I shivered despite the layers of my uniform. Room 7 had been emptied for a few days. The last patient who occupied it, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, had passed away in his sleep about 4 days ago. He had been a kind man, though his last days were filled with pain and confusion. I remember he used to sit on a little rocking chair and stare at the ceiling, whispering to someone who wasn't there. As I walked past the room, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from inside room 7. I slowly approached the door, the tapping growing louder with each step. I hesitated for a moment before gently pushing the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small window on the far wall. The bed was neatly made, just as it had been since Mr. Thompson had passed. But what caught my eye was the old wooden rocking chair in the corner of the room. It's not very noticeable, but I can tell that it was kind of rocking. I froze, unable to move or speak. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation, but there was none. The chair continued to rock, reminding me of when Mr. Thompson would sit there and complaining that he cannot breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the chair stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence. I took a step back, my pulse racing, and I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the direction of the bed.
I can't breathe.
The voice was weak, frail, and unmistakably Mr. Thompson's. My blood ran cold. I knew he was gone, yet here I was, hearing his voice as clearly as if he were lying in that bed once again. Either I'm hearing his voice or my mind was playing with me. I turned and fled from the room, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station, where I found the nursing assistant. "Did you see something?" she whispered. I nodded, too shaken to speak. We sat there in silence for the rest of the night, neither of us daring to go near room 7 again. The next morning, I reported the incident to the oncoming nurse, expecting her to laugh it off or tell me it was just my imagination. Instead, she looked at me with a somber expression and said, "You're not the first to hear him. Mr. Thompson was always asking for help in his last days. I suppose some part of him is still waiting for someone to answer." From that night on, I avoided room 7 as much as possible, and I wonder if I had stayed, if I had tried to help, would he have finally found peace? Or would I have been lost to whatever restless spirit still lingers in that old forgotten room? Story number 6. I was a new nurse working at a nursing home when this event happened. There was an elderly couple that lived in room 11. From what I know, Mr. and Mrs. Clark had lived there for almost 3 years. During my orientation, Mrs. Clark was sent to the hospital one day. I wasn't aware of it, but a few days later, Mrs. Clark died at the hospital. Mr. Clark had dementia, so I wasn't sure if he knew that his wife had passed away. Once I finished my orientation, I was trained by a senior nurse on the day shift. Then, when I was on my own, I worked the swing shift from 3 p.m. until 11 p.m. After working there for 6 months, one day during breakfast, Mr. Clark swallowed food down the wrong pipe and started coughing, gagging, and becoming short of breath. The food went into his lungs. Mr. Clark was rushed to the hospital and put on a ventilator. A few days later, Mr. Clark died at the hospital. Shortly after Mr. Clark died, one day I was working, and Mr. Clark's daughter called to say she would be coming in the morning to pick up Mr. Clark's belongings. The nursing assistant, Lori, went into Mr. Clark's room to check his belongings. Lori had a list of what Mr. Clark had in terms of personal items. After about 20 minutes, Lori called me into Mr. Clark's room and told me that Mr. Clark's hearing aids were missing. It was the only thing left that she couldn't find. I helped Lori double-check everything, but we still couldn't find them. Then I opened the nightstand and saw a blue urn. I was a bit freaked out and asked Lori if that was an urn with ashes in it, and she said, "Oh, that's Mrs. Clark." I didn't know that Mrs. Clark had been cremated, and that her ashes were kept in the room with Mr. Clark. Both Lori and I couldn't find the hearing aids, but we did bag everything up for Mr. Clark's daughter to pick up the next morning. That night, around 10:45 p.m., I was at the nurse's station with the staff, getting ready for the night shift to arrive. Suddenly we heard noises coming from room 11, where Mr. and Mrs. Clark used to live. It sounded like someone was hitting the walls or slamming cabinets or drawers. We went to check, but there was nothing in the room. The next day, Mr. Clark's daughter came and picked up the belongings. The daughter was informed by the staff at the nurse's station that we couldn't find Mr. Clark's hearing aids. However, the daughter said that Mr. Clark was actually wearing his hearing aids when he was sent to the hospital, and that the hospital staff had already given them to her to take home. What a relief, because hearing aids are expensive. After that, the Clark's old room was cleaned and prepared for new patients. That night, around 9 p.m., we had just turned off most of the lights in the hallway so the patients could sleep. Suddenly, there was banging and noise coming from the Clark's old room. The CNA, Lori, went to the room, turned on the light, and said, "Mrs. Clark, they've found the hearing aids, and Mary has already taken them home." After that, Lori came back to the nurse's station. I asked her why she said that, and she explained that Mr. Clark losing or forgetting where he left his hearing aids was a common issue. Mrs. Clark always helped him look for them, and would often get angry at him, sometimes yelling and slamming cabinet doors as she was looking for the missing hearing aids. After that, there were no more noises or commotion coming from the Clark's old room. I've never dealt with things like this before, but I'm sure some of the staff who have worked at the nursing home for a long time have experienced similar situations. They seem to know what to do or say to calm the spirits down. Story number 7. In my years as a nurse, I've seen many things that can't be explained, but one experience stands out above the rest. It happened during my 3rd year on the night shift at an old hospital in a small town. The building was ancient, the kind that creaked and groaned with the slightest breeze, and had a reputation for strange occurrences. Most of us brushed off the stories, but what happened that night made me a believer. It was a particularly quiet night, the kind where time seems to stretch, and you find yourself counting down the hours until dawn. I was assigned to the geriatric unit on the 3rd floor, where the long-term care patients were housed. The patients were mostly elderly, many of them nonverbal, lost in their own worlds due to age or illness. The atmosphere was always a bit somber, but that night it felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. Around 2 a.m. I was doing my rounds, checking in on the patients one by one. The floor was dimly lit, and the silence was so deep that the sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. I reached room 313, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Owens was staying. She had been in the hospital for weeks, completely unresponsive, and was essentially kept alive by the machines surrounding her bed. I'd checked on her countless times before, and nothing had ever been out of the ordinary until that night. As I pushed open the door to her room, I was immediately struck by the chill in the air. It was significantly colder than the rest of the floor, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the monitors and the light from the hallway spilling in. Mrs. Owens lay motionless in her bed, just as she always did, her face pale and gaunt. But something was different. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. I approached the bed, checking the monitors. Everything appeared normal, her vitals steady, the machines humming quietly. Then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Owens' eyes were open. This might not sound unusual, but in all the weeks she had been there, her eyes had never opened. She had been in a deep, unresponsive state, her eyelids always closed. But now, they were wide open, staring straight ahead with a blank, empty gaze. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Her eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just stared straight ahead as if looking at something I couldn't see. I tried to tell myself it was just a reflex, something purely physical, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Then, in the silence, I heard it, a faint, whispering sound, so soft it was almost inaudible. I leaned in closer, trying to make out the words, but they were too faint, too garbled to understand. Suddenly, Mrs. Owens's mouth moved. Her lips parted slightly, and a raspy, breathless voice whispered,
"He's here."
I stumbled back, my heart racing. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. It was as if dozens of people were speaking at once, but the words were still too jumbled to comprehend. The whispering stopped, and Mrs. Owens's eyes slowly closed, her face returning to the expressionless mask it had been before. I stood there trembling, trying to process what had just happened. I left the room after that, and I told the other nurse on duty what had happened, but she just gave me a skeptical look and said I must have been imagining things. I wanted to believe her, to write it off as a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that room with me. The next morning, when the day shift came in, I reported what had happened to the day nurse. She listened carefully, her face growing pale as I recounted the events. When I finished, she sighed and told me that room 313 had a history. Over the years, several patients had died in that room, all under mysterious circumstances. Some nurses claimed to have seen shadows moving in the corners, or heard voices late at night. Mrs. Owen passed away later that week. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.